Hey everyone, because chapter 5 is such a big one, I am going to actually film it in segments. So let's talk about the first about 19 slides in this file in this particular video session. And we're looking at teaching general strategies, which is why it's so hefty. This is, a big one. Again, we're going to focus on the first couple of learning objectives in this particular video, and then I will have different videos for the remaining chunks, depending on how long we go. And I should probably time that a little bit so it's not too crazy. Sorry, guys. So I'm not going to go through all the learning objectives right now. I'm going to let you go ahead and read those in your own time, but I will kind of touch base here on them as we go into the different sections. So the first part of this chapter is talking about structure and teaching. And the learning objective of this chapter is that we relate common characteristics of students with autism to recommended environmental structure, order, and clarity. And apparently I'm having a microphone issue, so sorry about that. The subtitles aren't working, but I'm going to put it in YouTube where the closed captioning will be available. Okay, so thinking about teaching strategies, we know that our students with autism really benefit from higher structured learning environments that they need, that include materials that are related to that, consistent routines and procedures, various visual aids that can serve as prompts or cues for the desired behavior throughout. Those are sort of like the meat and potatoes of what works for students with autism from what we've seen so far. And then the idea being that we don't always provide those max levels of structure and routine and procedure, but we gradually decrease that to get our students sort of prepared or more comfortable with what happens in the general learning environment and or the community at large, or in a competitive integrated workplace, right? We want to get them sort of prepared for that. So although we might need some significant structure and supports initially, the hope is that you can eventually fade some of that, or help the student learn how to create their own system that they can kind of individualize and use independently. But back to teaching strategies. Teaching strategies include everything a teacher does to facilitate learning. So that includes the list of things we see here: instructional formats, student-teacher ratios, which will vary greatly from classroom to classroom, the pace of your instruction, the types of activities that you do, assessment strategies, physical arrangement of the classroom, that's a big one, classroom procedures and routines, and then the types of materials that you use. This is all part and parcel of teaching strategies. We have evidence-based practices or high leverage practices that encompass all of these. So it's not just about what's the best way to teach reading. We want to look at everything really at large when we consider teaching strategies. So the text talks about needing a highly structured approach to instruction, including the way you have your classroom set up, the materials, the schedule, the lessons, because ideally you want to cue and prompt the types of responses you want from your students. That's why we do a lot of the data collection I'm having you do, the ecological inventories, the behavior, observations, because sometimes we set up a situation, we have an antecedent strategy, an environmental trigger of some kind that prompts an undesired response. So something that we could possibly implement, rather than creating a behavior plan based on that, we actually change something in the antecedent, in the setting, that whatever is the trigger for the student. But you also want to have a highly structured method of monitoring performance for your students. Sorry, frequent performance feedback, and also monitoring their progress on all those different skills, okay, that you started developing in your curriculum development plan in chapter 4. The reason we approach this instruction in a highly structured way is so that students make fewer mistakes and have frequent opportunities to practice the correct response. So we talk about in general that failure is a great way to learn. And that is true. But for students with autism, sometimes allowing that space to fail actually creates a bigger problem. So, or it creates a situation where the student doesn't learn from that it was a failure and continues with that incorrect response. So that means we have to approach instruction for our students potentially a little differently. And we want to support errorless learning. That's the goal of highly structured instruction. We don't want students to make mistakes to master their learning objectives. So you approach that interaction with your students and the teaching process differently. It's not so much an inquiry based where you let them explore, it's more of direct instruction, which is what we're going to talk about a lot in this chapter, actually. So let's begin by talking about structuring through lesson presentation. The learning objective for this section is that you'd be able to compare and contrast the recommended instructional formats that include direct instruction, discrete trial teaching, and milieu teaching. So I'm going to try to cover all of those. So we'll actually go a little bit beyond that 20 slides to get milieu teaching in there as well by the end of this video. Okay, and I know a lot of you have heard the term explicit instruction. It is a lesson presentation format based in ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, and they're set up to be systematic, direct, engaging, and success-oriented. So we're really focusing on curricular goals and student abilities when planning. Keeping in mind that because our students are on a spectrum, we definitely have a spectrum of need in this area. So students who are perhaps on the lower end of the spectrum will most likely need a lot more structure, a lot more repetition than those on the higher end of the spectrum. So make sure you're choosing your lesson presentation formats based on the curricular goals and student abilities of the students that you work with. And you need to be aware of the different types of instructional formats and master those. That's your job here. As experts in autism, so you're supposed to be by the end of this program, you should be aware of all of these instructional formats and how to implement them. This is your expertise. It's not a content area. It's actually in the instruction of folks with autism. So this chapter is really important for you to dig into and understand, regardless of the type of student that you work with, low end or high end or anywhere in between. You need to know how these all work so that you can make sure you're using what's appropriate for your students' educational needs. So this part gets a little confusing, and this chapter talks about direct instruction in two different ways: a little di, a lowercase di, and then uppercase di. Both are best for students who receive the majority of their instruction in general education classrooms. It's designed more to fit within that environment. Common components of both little di and big di are highly structured lessons. There are consistent types of instructional activities and instructional delivery methods. So you have kind of a common daily schedule or methodology that students get familiar with, and you review previously taught content within each lesson. So built into each lesson is a review of what was taught in the previous lesson in this content area. Little DI is a sequenced set of teaching steps and procedures. Big DI is kind of a broader idea. It's a research-based integrated system of curriculum design and effective instructional delivery. So let's break that down a little bit. What you see here are the 7 steps to little DI. This is based on Rosenshine's description of direct instruction. And it's just a way that teachers can present lessons systematically. So first you get them, so you can use any type of curriculum for this and then set it up in this format, and that would fit into the little DI. So you get students ready to learn. This could include prompting them that we're about to get started. This includes reviewing behavior expectations and discussing how and motivating students to follow those behavior expectations. Then that step 2 is the review of prior learning and creating that connection to what you're about to teach. Step 3 is presenting the new content in a task analyzed format. So you have it broken down for students. You're going to model exemplars and non-exemplars to highlight the really important elements of the concept being taught. And you might teach step by step. Then the next step is checking for understanding of that new content. So you have a pause there. There you check with your students. You move into a teacher guided practice phase where you can provide corrections and feedback right there as the students are going through that. And then we have the independent practice component. So does this sound familiar? A little I do, we do, you do situation here. And then you complete weekly and monthly reviews. So we see this a lot in general education environments. Most teachers are taught to sort of teach along this continuum of steps. So for your students who are accessing the gen ed environment more frequently than others, this will likely be the type of instruction they'll see. And so I hope that you are familiar with this one in general. Big DI is a little bit different. It's really focused on specific curriculum that's created using scripted lessons. It does require frequent responses from students, uses an errorless learning process, and there's a lot of frequent reinforcement for that correct response. There are a set of prescribed components for big direct instruction. That includes presentation of information, tasks, task chains, exercises, sequences of exercises or tracks, lessons, and organization of content. So there might be there's a lot of procedures to follow when you're using the big DI. You're supposed to present it exactly in this way. That's the scripted piece, right? In order to fulfill the requirements of the big DI. So in your text, there's a few more examples, but here we look at some sample DI reading curriculum from McGraw-Hill. So they've created scripted lesson plans that go along these. So there's reading mastery, corrective reading, horizons for grades K through 4, and read to achieve are some of the examples they talk about here. Your school may use some form of scripted lessons, some big DI. In fact, if you're not sure, I would encourage you to check into that. There are definitely programs in math. There are programs in language arts as well that follow this format, a very prescribed curriculum format. Again, you'll see this more in general curriculum environments. This might be in situations where we have a lot of students needing almost tier 2 level supports. And so they're in this more prescribed program. And that's when you'll see a lot of this in your schools. However, it may not be that your student with autism is actually even ready for that level of scripted response. And so another method that we want to look at right now is discrete trial training. You'll see it represented as DTT a lot. And this is the best documented and most widely used ABA-based teaching strategy for students with autism. It was begun by Ivar Lovaas at UCLA back in the 60s, and has continued to have a very distinct following since then, We have a lot of evidence that the methodology in this works for especially for specific types of task learning. It's highly structured based on that three-term contingency, right? Antecedent, behavior, consequence. Remember, we talked about that in an earlier chapter. The purpose, with discrete trial training, skills are taught through repeated structured presentations. So what we call them trials. So you're going to do, it's like that drill and practice idea, right? You're going to do a trial, a trial, a trial, a trial. You're going to do kind of a bunch in a row. So, and it follows this sort of path that you see here. Teacher directions, the input and prompting or the antecedent stimuli, the student response, and then the teacher feedback, which is the consequence stimuli, and then some method of tracking. So you're usually, when you're doing discrete trial training, you're taking data on each trial. So you have you have some data collection tool in front of you when you're implementing this practice. And typically you're doing that one-on-one. The governing theory of discrete trial training is that you want students to respond with certain behaviors to certain external stimuli, and you want to make sure they don't respond in other ways. So you go through a process of discrimination training and stimulus control. Discrimination training means you are training the student to understand the difference in behavior and stimuli. For example, your text talks about you want to ensure that the stimulus you provide, you teach the student how to respond only in the specifically correct way and not an approximation of that, in the final answer. So for example, if you're teaching a child to say cat, you're looking for cat being pronounced just like that, not car or pat or dog. Okay, so you're looking for something very specific here. This discrete trial training follows a 5-step lesson presentation. You present the discriminative stimulus. You prompt if necessary. There should be a student response. You present the consequence to that response. And then you do an intertrial interval or pause before the next trial. So you have some way to signal that pause signals, okay, we did it once. We're going to pause. Now we're going to start over. Okay, here we go again. And then after you've gone through those 5 steps, and when you hit that interval or pause, that's the end of one of your trials. And you'll do that several times, typically in a row. Your text, before I talk about milieu, your text goes deeper into what is a discriminative stimulus, what do prompts include, and the kind of the hierarchy of prompts. So make sure you're reading through those carefully. We could honestly do a whole lot of training on just discrete trial training. I'm not going to do that in this particular video. I'm just going to do an overview of the chapter here. So go back into that text and really read through that. Because if you're going to use discrete trial training, you really need to be comfortable with that process and how it works. And table 5.4 actually has a really great outline of prompt fading procedures. Excuse me, there are lots of different prompting systems you could use, but anyway, take a look at that. It's really very interesting and informative, and there's a lot of examples in your text. I'm looking at it right now of how you can take data, how you can assess the student progress in discrete trial training, how you can lay that out in graph form. So definitely look at all of those. All right, now let's talk about milieu teaching, MT. Milieu teaching involves a set of instructional procedures also based in ABA. It's primarily used to teach and enhance language and social communication skills. So if you're planning to use this form of teaching, keep in mind that's what its kind of focus or purpose is. And milieu is a French word for environment or setting, which sort of helps you understand that um, it's really describing more of a naturally occurring situation teaching model where teachers purposely take advantage of teachable moments to obtain specific types of communication, social interaction, and then followed by prompts and reinforcement for the appropriate responses. So we've talked a little bit about that, different methods of doing that, whether you're keeping something just out of somebody's reach and, something that they prefer in order to get them to, you might be setting up milieu teaching a little bit, but you're using the natural environment to encourage that communication and reinforce the types of communicative and social responses that you're looking for with your students. It includes some short positive interactions uh, administered in the setting in which the behavior naturally occurs. Unlike discrete trial training can be very kind of clinical and very specifically set up, whereas milieu teaching is much more about, what's going on in the environment naturally and really looking for those moments to teach those social communication skills in that environment. And it's guided by the student's interest in the task, which is important because then you have a lot of motivation just inherently built into the milieu teaching process. So when we compare the two, milieu teaching and then discrete trial training, um, they include some developmental social pragmatic components in each. They both aim to increase the frequency and quality of language. I'm sorry, milieu teaching aims to increase frequency and quality of language and social communication responses. It emphasizes that naturally occurring discriminative stimulus, which is that SDS, rather than one developed by a teacher. Now, you can definitely sort of set up situations that might lead to more specific interactions in a milieu teaching environment, but you're not forcing a child to interact with that. You're really like watching the child and seeing what they get into and then joining in to engage in this teaching procedure, unlike discrete trial training where you go and sit at a table and go through certain things. Does use specific prompts in a least to most prompting system order, aligns programmed reinforcing consequences more directly with anticipated naturally occurring reinforcers signaled by the discriminative stimulus, as opposed to in discrete trial training where you usually say, okay, what are you working for? It's very set up. This one is designed more to provide the naturally occurring reinforcers in that environment. It's not a drill and practice format. There's brief trials or naturally occurring opportunities for that target skill practice. One thing I want to note specifically is that milieu teaching is a useful strategy to support maintenance and generalization. So when we're looking at level of competency, milieu teaching fits more into when students are within that maintenance and generalization phase. Also that language piece, whereas discrete trial training would be better suited for that initial skill acquisition and the fluency phase that we talked about, depending on what you're teaching, really. DTT is used more for academic skills as well as social and other types of instruction, but MT is usually more geared toward language and social skill development. Sorry, So we talk about milieu teaching being a naturalistic teaching process, and it is, but like I mentioned earlier, that sometimes means that as a teacher, you sort of disrupt a normal routine or situation in order to create the need for the student to communicate something. And then have a series of prompts ready to go if they need some support getting to asking for that thing in the way that you're trying to reach, right? You're scaffolding that for the student, but part of it is trying to get joint attention started with a student. And that's why you disrupt the routine, or you put something out of the way, or you have a piece of a puzzle missing, because you want the student to realize that there's something not quite right here, and then join you with their attention so that you can engage in some instruction. And this is a much more motivating process for our students in many ways, because that they're already interested in this thing, instead of trying to start on something. The challenge with like discrete trial training is they may or may not want anything to do with what you're talking about. Whereas milieu teaching, you're kind of honing in on what they're already interested in, to teach something, and something specific. But it's important to also note that even though this is like a naturalistic teaching process, you do need to take data on it, okay? Because you need to know if a specific method is just not working, and you want to show progress, right? So page 138 of your text shows some examples of how to collect data using this method. So look at figure 5.4. It's a milieu teaching data form. I'm going to try to also upload like the blank versions of all these forms within the module, so you can download and use them as you want, as you see fit. All right, and we're going to stop here for this particular video, and I'll do a different one as we jump into grouping and so on.